By the late 1980s, Detroit was seeing roughly 2 murders per day. Police corruption was out of control, and to make matters worse, the city was littered with abandoned homes. These made the perfect place for sales and were a hotbed for crime. It was the infamous crack era, and everyone was either using or selling this addictive substance. Those selling made millions, whilst those using ended up strung out and powerless to their addictions. The Best Friends gang were also powerless to their addictions, theirs being murder and money. In just 5 years, the gang reportedly killed over 100 people and terrorized the east side of the city. This is the story of the Best Friends. The Best Friends gang was founded by 4 brothers on Detroit's east side. They were Terrence Boogaloo Brown, Reggie Rockin' Reg Brown, Ezra Wizard Brown, and Gregory Ghost Brown. The Browns had grown up in a middle-class household, but as they reached their late teens, opportunities within the city had diminished. They headed into crime and started out as an enforcement crew for Demetrius Meech Holloway, a big-time kingpin. The brothers took his orders. Demetrius supplied them with weaponry, bulletproof vests, and legal representation, should they be caged by Detroit PD. The Best Friends displayed levels of violence unseen within Detroit. Their job was to control street dealers and prevent rivals from muscling in on Demetrius Holloway's territory. Over time, they gained a reputation for being ruthless and bloodthirsty. In spite of the fact that they'd grown up with Demetrius Holloway, a conflict arose between them. Rick Carter was Demetrius Holloway's right-hand man and primarily dealt with the Brown brothers. He was loved by everyone in Detroit and was the first person to have imported a yellow Maserati from Europe. It has been said that Maserati Rick introduced Holloway's plug to the Best Friends, and they were getting a few keys from him by this stage. This didn't sit right with Holloway, who had been in prison whilst all of this was going on. From his perspective, the Best Friends were simply his enforcement crew, and he didn't have much respect for them when it came to doing business. They were the types to backstab you and wouldn't hesitate to get rid of you if you were seen as a weak link. Additionally, the Brown brothers openly embraced Maserati Rick, but behind the scenes, they resented him because of his success. As the street beefs continued, the brothers recruited local muscle to help them achieve their goal of total control over Detroit's east side. They were still the enforcement arm of Holloway and Maserati Rick's operation, but friendly relationships were soon to unravel. At its height, the Best Friends organization was comprised of nearly 50 members. Some of the most notable people included Stacy the Machine Culbert, Charles Chucky Doo Wilkes, and Nate Boone Kraft. Nate Kraft was interesting because he was a former soldier who was trained to kill. He'd started working as a bodyguard for Maserati Rick and later received the nickname of the Grim Reaper. With a crew of enforcers in place, Terrence Boogaloo Brown was determined to be the sole distributor on Detroit's east side. As time wore on, more people were being murdered. Jealousy and envy took a hold of the Best Friends, and Holloway was now a target of their hate. Having returned home from prison in 1985, Holloway spoke ill of the Best Friends. With Holloway's Colombian connection, the Best Friends had began accumulating huge sums of money and became even more unpredictable. Holloway needed to be removed from the picture and they wanted his head. What the Brown brothers didn't realize was that this desire to inflict death came with major ramifications. Ezra and Gregory Brown would be gunned down in separate incidents. Boogaloo and Rockin' Reg planned out and sought revenge for the murders, sending and sometimes accompanying members on hits. However, they had built up countless enemies within the city. Therefore, they weren't exactly sure who had ordered or carried out the 2 hits. They suspected Holloway and began systematically carrying out hits on rival groups on Detroit's east side. The crew were widely feared amongst criminals within Detroit. They tracked their targets for months, sometimes years, and found addresses through corrupt Detroit police. In some instances, victims were abducted off the street. Not only were the Best Friends feared, but the 4 main Brown brothers were imposing. Sure, Ezra and Gregory were now gone, but the remaining 2 Brown brothers stood over 6 feet tall and with a propensity for pulling the trigger. Conflicts inevitably started all across Detroit. Terrence Boogaloo Brown was really the brains behind the operation, with Reggie Rockin' Reg Brown being the main enforcer, being described as a psychopath because of his willingness to shoot people. The year 1987 was the year that law enforcement really began investigating kingpins in Detroit. Law enforcement agencies were wiretapping big-time players, including the Best Friends. The gang was believed to be selling vast quantities per week, generating a lot of money. However, they were mainly doing paid hits. The DEA believed that 80% of the city's supply was coming from Demetrius Holloway. He was more interested in business moves than unnecessary acts of violence. Maserati Rick was shot at a Detroit car wash. Whilst in hospital, a hitman wearing a doctor's outfit casually walked into his room and gunned him down. At his funeral, Maserati Rick was buried in a $20,000 Mercedes coffin. His right-hand man now deceased, Holloway thought it best to fake his own death. The heat from law enforcement and the best friends was becoming too much for him. His life was in danger, and weeks after Maserati Rick died, he staged a shooting and abduction outside a burger stand. Everyone thought that he was dead, but in reality, Holloway had fled underground. For 3 months he would stay hidden but eventually surfaced. Having just returned from serving a prison sentence, Nate Boone Kraft was furious. He became an informer against the Best Friends gang because they'd killed his brother over an unpaid debt. Kraft began taking people out, people who were supposedly involved with his brother's death. Around this same time, he walked into the main investigation room for the Best Friends case, and gave up everything on 6 of the members of the Best Friends gang. He was now working with the DEA. Boogaloo walked up to the car of a rival gangster named James Mr. Big Lamont and began firing. The reason for the murder was because Lamont was encroaching on the Best Friends territory. This murder had him wanted by law enforcement agencies because of its brazen nature. The last place that anybody would have expected a murder was at the Broadway clothing store. It was a neutral zone in a sense, and nobody anticipated what was to happen next. Demetrius Holloway was shopping for Ralph Lauren socks alongside his girlfriend when he was gunned down. He should have stuck to the shadows but had decided to return to the spotlight. This decision cost him his life. A gunman got out of a BMW, walked in the store and shot Holloway twice in the back of the head. Holloway hit the floor, $17,000 left sitting in his pocket. The hitman snapped his fingers and said, "Got him," before walking out of the clothing store, whistling in celebration. Lester Milton was convicted of the shooting in 2005. His brother was the getaway driver, and to this day, nobody is sure who ordered the hit, although Terrence Brown is the most likely candidate. Nate Boone Kraft was set up by his own gang. It has been said that Terrence Brown had learned about Boone informing on the Best Friends. Boogaloo paid the hitmen $20,000 to kill Boone. They used the ruse of targeting a man who'd killed a Best Friends member. Everyone was armed and began firing. However, Boone felt impacts to his side and realized that it was a setup. Somehow, his gang failed to kill him and he was rushed to hospital. Ultimately recovering from his near-death encounter, Nate Boone Kraft would violate parole for trying to kill the man. Law enforcement had learned about what had happened. Nate Boone Kraft was sent off to prison. Seeking revenge for his brother's death, he decided to wait for Boogaloo to come to prison because he wanted to do him inside. However, Boogaloo never set foot in the prison. By this stage, Boogaloo had turned himself in for the murder of James Lamont. He was later acquitted of the crime. Luck was seemingly on the side of the 2 Brown brothers because Rockin' Reg was also let go for his own murder conviction. In his case, Rockin' Reg killed a man because he dated the same woman as him. For this crime, he was given life imprisonment, but having only served a year in jail, he was released on an appeal bond. A new trial was ordered in the case. This never happens, and it goes to show you the type of corruption that was around in Detroit at the time. Within a short space of time of being released, Rockin' Reg was suspected in a quadruple murder. One of the people killed was a suspected informant, and a 3-year-old girl was killed in the gunfire. With more people being killed by the day and with law enforcement agencies closing in, the Best Friends became paranoid from all fronts, and began popping each other off. Everything was falling apart, and the 2 main Brown brothers fled Detroit because of fear of being apprehended by law enforcement. The Best Friends gang had expanded their trade to other states, and with the feds applying pressure to the gang hierarchy, much of the gang had split and disbanded. Major law enforcement agencies assigned resources to find the brothers. Rockin' Reg was caught in New York, with Boogaloo narrowly avoiding apprehension. He fled from police on a motorcycle. Terrence Brown had escaped to the state of Georgia. He received $600,000 from his attorney Paul Curtis, to be used for a major deal. However, he was double-crossed and was later found gunned down in the trunk of a pickup truck. Boogaloo had been set up by members of his own gang. The Machine and Chucky Doo were the suspected culprits. Law enforcement convicted many people in the Best Friends gang. By the time that convictions began, many people named in the indictment had already been killed. Detroit is still a violent city, but it is definitely not as violent as it was in the 1980s. The Best Friends gang ruled with brute force but paid the price for their crimes. The reality of living this life is prison or death, and the destruction caused by this group is now part of the city's tragic history.